a good look at Jacob's life, and I hope that's reminded you of the things you knew deep down, but it gives us an overview of Jacob's life. We've actually got a lot of detail about him in the Bible, from his birth to his death. And during that time, that 147 years, we see a life transformed. Jacob was a schemer. He tried to control things himself. He had to run away from his brother, as we said, for fear of his life. And then he was out-schemed by Uncle Laban. But even in these things, Jacob was still being, in various ways, obedient to God. He knew God's promises, but he had to be brought to a point where he gave up his self-sufficiency and trusted in God. His life was messy, his family life was messy, but God was at work in all that mess. God was there present. So this morning I'd like us to focus on that encounter, that struggle, that wrestling that Steve just read about for us. It's a fascinating time, but we've probably got to do a bit of background work to appreciate that point when Jacob wrestled with God. 20 years earlier, as we said from our things. You remember we had the 20 years, the 7 years, the 7 years, and then the 6 years. 20 years. 20 years earlier, when we had the vision of Jacob's ladder, Jacob had left. And at Bethel, when he had that vision, he'd seen angels going up that stairway. He'd seen God at the top. He'd seen the earth at the bottom. But at that time, God had promised him that his descendants would be like the dust of the earth. And he also said that all the peoples on earth would be blessed through Jacob and his offspring, which is obviously looking forward to Jesus. And he promised that he would be with Jacob. He would watch over him, and he promised that he would bring him back to Canaan, which is where he was leaving at that time, running away from Isaac. We too know that God cares for us. We've got a Bible. I've got two Bibles here. We've got Bibles that tell us of God's rich love for us and how he cares for us. In those 20 years, as we had during that little quiz time, he lived with Uncle Laban, he fell in love with Rachel, he was tricked into marrying Leah, and because of their rivalry, he also married Rachel's handmaid and Leah's handmaid, and he had children through them as well. As I say, this was the foundation of a very, very messy family, the foundation for very messy lives. At the end of 20 years, the 7 years, and the 6, God told Jacob to return to Canaan. And the first part of that chapter 32 that we didn't read, God has told Jacob to return to Canaan, and Jacob obeys. First off, there's more than a misadventure with Laban, and Laban comes and chases him, and they make peace. God has to tell Laban, don't touch Jacob. Jacob's my man. He appears to Laban and warns Laban from hurting Jacob. And Jacob finds himself in this very, very difficult situation. God's told him to return to Canaan, but in Canaan is his brother, the brother who said, the next time I see you, I'm going to kill you. So when we come to this wrestling match, we need to understand the situation that's gone before. And as we do this, we're going to see Jacob's life transformed, and we're then going to see encouragement, panic, prayer, a plan, a struggle, and evidence of change. So let's start with the encouragement. At the start of chapter 32, there's just one verse that tells us how Jacob was encouraged. He was traveling with all this wealth. He was very rich now. So his rather large caravan containing, it wasn't just that he had a gold platinum card. He was traveling with all of his wealth. His wealth was a large caravan of sheep goats, camels, cows, bulls, donkeys, and all the herdsmen that were needed to look after all these animals. With the herdsmen would have been the families of the herdsmen that were looking after all these. There were his own families. He's effectively got 4 wives. At this point, he had 11 sons and a daughter. They're all travelling with him in this very large train. He would have had his own personal servants that would have been looking after him, looking after his possessions, because this was a large group of people. They were making their way south to Canaan. And as they do this, Jacob has a vision or sees the angels of God. They were camped. They calls it Manahem. It means 2 camps. We know nothing more about it. The fact that it's called Manahem implies there were 2 camps of angels. That's all we know. There's no message from God. There's no subsequent about this. I've not found any other reference to this in the scripture. It happened. It encouraged Jacob. I'm sure it encouraged him. And maybe on the basis of that encouragement, he thought, I shall go, I shall send a message ahead of us to brother Esau and tell him I'm coming. So that's what he did. Then we get a panic, because the message came back. I mean, we're talking a fair amount of time here. You know, it takes a long while to move. We're not talking instant communication. You send somebody off with a message. One is they've got to find Esau. Having found Esau, they've got to come back. They knew generally where Jacob and all this train of people were traveling, but it took time. It would have been over a considerable amount of time as far as we would see it. But the message comes back. Esau's coming to meet you with 400 men. Jacob was panicked, seriously panicked. They were afraid, because this wasn't an encouraging message. Oh, great, my brother's coming to meet me, and there's going to be a few blokes with him to help me with all these goods. It was, oh no, there's 400 men. He knows I'm a large group of people. He's coming with 400 men to make sure they can defeat me. He's going to take my life. What am I going to do? So Jacob made a plan, the first of his plans. He said, I'm going to split our caravan into 2 groups. Maybe if Esau does attack us, one group will get away whilst the other one effectively gets killed. But let's see what happens. Then he prayed. And as he prays, he lays the situation out to God. And he looks for reasons to trust God, and he expresses his confusion about the situation he's in. Now that prayer is in Genesis 32, 9-12, if you want to follow it along. Jacob knows who he's praying to. He knows he's praying to the God of Abraham and the God of Isaac. That is the God of his grandfather and the God of his father. Very, very personal relationships that he knew his father and his grandfather had with God. This is the same God who he's praying to, who 20 years earlier gave him this wonderful vision of the ladder. The same God who promised his descendants are going to become a great nation and the whole earth is going to be blessed to him, is also the same God who had told him, go back to your country and your relatives and I will make you prosper. He's following God's instruction. He's obeying God. But as you read that prayer, there's an undertone, and the undertone is, God, I'm here, and all this trouble is because I'm here, and I'm here because you told me to be here, so actually this is your fault. There's definite undertone of that in this prayer. And if you can identify in some way with that at some point in your life, you will be understanding some of where Jacob was. Because I'm sure at various points in our lives, we've said to God, I think I'm doing what you want me to do, but actually I'm still in trouble. And if that's not you, somebody near you probably will be. That's where Jacob was. I'm in trouble, but actually, God, really it's your fault because I'm just doing what you told me to do. Then, really importantly, in the next phrase of the prayer, Jacob recognizes where he is, not geographically, not just north of Israel as we now know it is, but where he is as a man. He's unworthy of all the kindness and faithfulness that God has shown him. He's unworthy of all these things that God has given him over the last 20 years. He sees himself as he really is, God's servant. 20 years ago, when he came across to Laban, all he had with him was his walking stick, his staff, his walking staff. But now he's got such a big group of family, herds, wealth, he can split them into 2 camps. But he's very, very afraid. So he asks God to save him from his brother. And he tells God of the fears that he's got. And he talks about his children being attacked with the mothers. The picture is not very nice. The language used, although it's not comes across clear, but when you read the picture, the words used in the Hebrew, I'm told, are the same language that's heard. That's as if there's a bird nesting with its chicks and a hawk comes along and decides that's lunch. The hawk comes down, attacks not only the nesting bird, the parent, kills that and eats that, and then eats the chicks. That's the picture that Jacob has in his mind of how it's going to be for his wives and his children. He is seriously afraid. Because we know the outcome of this story, I think it's difficult for us to appreciate just the danger that Jacob felt himself to be in. He felt very seriously afraid. But as I say, he's confused, because if that's going to happen, how can God's promise to him, I will surely make you prosper and make your descendants like the sand of the sea, which can't be counted? How can both of these be true? I don't understand, he's saying. It's a very, very real prayer. It's from the heart. It expresses what Jacob understands. I just encourage us to be very real in our prayers. Be real. Express to God as we really understand our situation. Because God knows our hearts. And in times of desperation, we might kid ourselves that maybe God doesn't, but he does. So be real. Express it to him. If we don't understand the situation, lay it out before him, because that's what he wants. He wants us to be very real to him. Jacob's prayer shows a reality, but it also shows us that at this stage in his life, Jacob probably only held God as being there for emergencies. I can thank God for all these good things, but actually, now there's an emergency, I'm really going to look to God. That's possibly where he was. So Jacob now made a plan. What would you have done? Your angry brother's coming for you. You've got all your family with you, and you think you're all in fear of your lives because your angry brother's coming with you effectively with a small army, and it could be to kill you all. You could have been brave and said, right, well, what I'm going to do is you guys all stay behind, 2 camps. We'll see what happens. If he attacks me, you both run. Maybe you'll both get away. But if he doesn't attack me, then we'll send a message and you can come. That would have been the brave option. But he doesn't. He says, I'll have a little scheme here. What I'll do is I'll take some of the flocks, some of the bulls, some of the camels, some of the sheep, some of the cows, and I'll send them all on as little packages. They weren't that little packages. They were quite big flocks. He sent them all on. And he sent them with a message with their herdsmen to say, when you find Esau, say to him, these are a gift for Esau. And your servant, not your brother, your servant, Jacob, is coming behind. It's a very, very rich gift that he sent. And then finally, Jacob, at this brook, he sent across his wives, his children, and lastly, he sent across his possessions, left himself alone. This was a man who was being transformed. This is a man you would not have bought a second-hand car from in the first part of his life. But at the end of his life, he's a man the writer to the Hebrews commends. He's a man of faith. But now he's scared. I'd just like to say, when he prayed and he made a plan, that's not two opposites. The prayer and the plan go together, but they go together in that order. We're not called to pray and then just sit back. We're called to pray and get on with life, getting on with the good works that God's called us to do. So if we have something to hand and we're praying about something, just like James says, it's no use praying about this poor guy who hasn't got a coat. You've got 3 in the wardrobe, go and get one and give it to him. Pray about it, pray for them, but be practical as well. It's exactly what Jacob does. He takes something to hand. He's got all this wealth. He takes this wealth and he uses that wealth to try and placate his brother. Similarly, we can do something like that. We can rest. Having prayed about something, we're then diligent about it. And knowing that we've been diligent about it, whether we've been able to do something, whether we've been able to do a little something or a great deal, we know we're leaving it all in God's hands, because actually everything is of God. The thing that makes Jacob's life so interesting is this fact that he hasn't fully surrendered to God. And probably we can identify with that. At this point, I don't think Jacob has realized that he's not fully surrendered to God. He thinks he's obeying God, but he hasn't fully surrendered. He's not even recognizing that himself. And I think that's something we can identify with. But anyway, at the end of that day, Jacob's left alone. Excuse me. I don't think he knew he was going to spend the night wrestling with somebody. I don't think he knew this other guy was about. But I think he did know he was going to spend the night struggling. Away from his wives, away from his young children, away from the servants. Maybe he wanted time to think, to struggle with the situation. Maybe just as you and I do in stressful times. We lay awake at night and we try and work through the situation in our minds. But instead of him being able to do that, God sent an angel in the form of a man to wrestle with him. Verse 24, so Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him until daybreak. Everything and everybody had gone except this man who's now wrestling with him. I'll ask you a question. Was this Jacob wrestling with God, as it says at the top of some of the passages in some versions of the Bible, or was it God wrestling with Jacob? You think, well, what's the difference? There's quite a difference, because if you wrestle with somebody, generally you wrestle with them because you want something from them. This man came along, God's representative, this angel, and wrestled with Jacob. Was this wrestling from Jacob's point of view? God, you told me to return to Canaan. I've done that. And now my brother's coming to kill me, and I'm scared. So I'm wrestling with you because I don't understand it, and I'm really worried about it. Or was it God wrestling with Jacob? I've blessed you. I've looked after you. I've looked after you through all that mess of you stealing Esau's birthright, the birthright that I said in a prophecy that you were going to have while you were still in the womb. Your parents knew that you were going to have the birthright, but you stole it, you took it, then you deceived. That mess, I've looked after you through that mess. You've ended up running away and you've ended up with 4 wives. I've looked after you through that mess. You've had to live with a scheming uncle. I've looked after you through that mess, and I've blessed you during that mess. But you still think you're self-sufficient. You still think you can scheme your way out of things. You still think you can get out of any situation. Maybe that was God wrestling with Jacob. Obviously, we don't know for sure. But what's going on here? It says it's a man. We know this was an angel because Hosea tells us this was an angel who wrestled with Jacob. It was a wrestling match between an angel as a man, a very, very strong figure, and Jacob, who's a man just like us. A wrestling match in which the strong man doesn't use all of his strength. A wrestling match where the stronger man lets the weaker man struggle so as to bring out the best in him, to drive out the worst. A match that's intended to cause change. A match that is for the weaker man's good, for the weaker man's best. But it's become a wrestling match because the weaker man won't give in. God does demand change from us. God wants us to be conformed to the image of his likeness. That's how he wants us to be. And it's grace that brings us to extreme times as God works in us. In whatever way God is refining us now, making us how he wants us to be, when we refuse and kick against it, it's actually God's grace that is allowing us to struggle on. In that struggle, like Jacob, as he clung on to the angel, we too must cling on, not letting him go until we have the blessing. But how much better it would have been if Jacob had submitted to God's angel in the first place and then clung on for the blessing rather than having to wrestle all night and then clinging on for the blessing at the end. Maybe there are times in our lives when we thought we were wrestling with God, but maybe we can look back and see that actually it was God wrestling with us, seeing what we're made of, bringing the gifts in us to the surface that he wants and putting the things that he doesn't want out of our lives. There does come a time where if we will not yield to God, he will intervene. Just as a father disciplines a child, there comes a time where the father, the mother, intervenes for the child's own good. So now as dawn approaches, Jacob's not yielded. So the angel, much, much stronger than Jacob, been wrestling all night with him, but much, much stronger, reaches out and touches his hip and dislocates Jacob's hip. Jacob finally realizes that he has to yield to God. So now he clings on, this time not to win because he knows he can't, but to gain a blessing. Maybe you're in the middle of a struggle like that now. If you are, do what Jacob did. Cling on. Hold tight. Don't let go. Cling on to God. And cling on to God. And cling on to God. Just like Jacob did, to come through. The blessing will come in the morning. That's not literally the morning. That's when the struggle's over. There's a new dawn, the new dawn, when you've come through. And then you'll find that God's been stronger all the while. The angel reached out and touched Jacob's hip, possibly leaving him with a limp for the rest of his life. And in some ways, if God has to touch you in that way, you might consider that humanly you're weaker now, that things aren't as good as they were before. But you will have come through. You'll know that in that struggle you've been with God. And actually, there is a greater blessing to come, even though you feel weakness at that point. Jacob was also given a new name, Israel. We don't know for sure what Israel means, although we talk about Israel all the time. We talk about the nation of Israel. We know Jacob's name became Israel. We think Israel means struggles with God. And we know, don't we, that the nation of Israel really did struggle with God. There were still hard times to come for Jacob, but he persevered. He clung on. He clung on to God's promises that he'd been given 20 years earlier, the promises that he knew had been given to Abraham and to Isaac. That struggle really changed Jacob's life, because in the next chapter, chapter 33, instead of Jacob placing himself behind all the flocks, all the herdsmen, all the goods, all the family, all the children, then him, he puts himself at the front and he faces Esau first, which I think is quite a dramatic change. And I've not seen anything to contradict that. But he puts himself first. He puts himself at the front. He now puts himself in danger as he sees it. If Jacob's ladder was the point at which Jacob, for the first time, really realized that God was real, now's the time he realizes that he needs to be emptied of himself and to stop trusting in his own cleverness and to begin to truly trust God. Then a few chapters on again, in chapter 35, we get evidence of change. God tells Jacob to return to Bethel and build an altar. Jacob obeys, And he tells his household and his family, get rid of the foreign gods you have with you, purify yourselves and change your clothes. Then let's go up to Bethel. Finally, we see Jacob making his family distinct for God. The idols and the talisman are to be put away. They're to be cleansed. They're to put on new clothes. If you've yielded to God and you're here this morning as a Christian, as a follower of Christ, as a disciple, you too, you've got a new name, Christian. You've been washed, cleansed by Jesus' blood. You've been given new clothes, Jesus' robe of righteousness, and you are being transformed. Maybe slowly, maybe at times quickly, but you're being transformed into the person God wants you to be. So you're to bury the idols. You're to bury the talisman that you've kept. Have there been hard times when you've struggled with things? Felt like you're struggling to understand them? Why am I here? Why is this happening? How can I possibly get through? Or is God wrestling with you, calling you to give up on self, to give up on conceit, to give up on your self-reliance, to give up on your greed, whatever that greed might be, to give up on your anger? Have you buried the old gods? Trust in your career, trust in wealth, or even a desire for wealth, your love of comfort, your love of ease, your love of other people's respect, your love of other people's applause. Have you left them behind as well, like Jacob and his household did, left them buried under a tree, never to go back to them again? That's what we're called to do, to leave all those things behind. And God encourages us today as Christians. As we meet together and hear the Bible explained, and as we read it at home, as we meet with Christian friends and talk about life living with Jesus and for Jesus, and as the Holy Spirit prompts us, we are being encouraged by God. We wrestle with the issues in our lives. We make our plans, but we rest in the certainty that God will either overrule the plans or we're following the things that he wants us to do. Because Jesus has promised to be with us in Matthew 28. He promised to be with us. There will be times when we panic. Hopefully, there'll be few. There'll be times when we're driven to pray. And there'll be times when we're conscious of making plans and wanting to do things God's way. We need to move forward, looking towards our loving God to correct us and guide us, to correct and guide the course that we take. But we could be walking in circumstances that are the results of our own bad behavior, our own bad choices. We could be walking in circumstances that are the product of other people's bad behavior towards us. But we can be sure, even in those times, the promise that was made to the Israelites in Jeremiah's time, I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you a hope and a future. That promise is true for us if our circumstances are good, or actually if our circumstances are very difficult. If we're trusting God, he has a plan for us. Jacob clung on to the angel of God to secure a blessing. We've got to cling on to God's promises in just the same way. We're going to stand and sing a song. This song was written in very desperate times. It was written by